Hey everybody, it's Party Lead, and today we're going to take a look at the upcoming Total War title set in the Three Kingdoms period, Total War Three Kingdoms. I was fortunate enough to be invited away from the bitter cold of Toronto down to an event in San Francisco where I had a chance to finally play the Three Kingdoms campaign, interact with all the mechanics, and speak to members of the dev team. Over the next few days, I'll be releasing a few videos, including this one. This one itself is going to focus on some key learnings from my time at this event in a somewhat rapid-fire format, and it will include both good and bad news, and it'll include news on new features as well as returning and missing features. Now, as we dive in, it's important to note that we only had the romance mode available to us. More details as to why that's the case will be in my interview video, because otherwise, I'd run out of time here. On which note, let's begin. Historical battles are back. I was frankly a little worried after Thrones of Britannia that we'd no longer see historical battles. Thankfully, that's not the case. Historical battles will be available through a separate menu item, much like in historical titles in previous years, and on the one hand, it's a little unfortunate that historical battles aren't included, like quest battles in the Warhammer games, but I suppose that it would involve needing to be the right faction at the right place at the right time. In future, I'd personally like to see both quest and historical battles, the former being missions with interesting scripted engagements at the end, and the latter being the traditional historical battles with introductions, scripted AI behavior, and other cool bits of bespoke game design. Of particular note is the inclusion of the Battle of Red Cliff. Rather than making it a naval battle, it's basically a land battle, starting after all the ships have crashed into each other, creating a plane on which to fight. Now, this could still be a pretty compelling custom handcrafted map for fighting to happen on, and I definitely want to see how it plays. I've always enjoyed historical battles, and I'm glad they're being included. I just hope they get balanced with every update, as they often tend to get a lot harder to play or a lot easier to play as updates come through for the game. Open Unit Recruitment. This will come as some good news to any of you who are under the same impression I was about recruitment. Generals are able to recruit, based on your current tech level and government rank, any unit into their retinue, but different generals have access to different high-tier units, and different generals have synergies with specific units, allowing for a better performance. I'm definitely glad that this is the case, as I was quite concerned about recruitment being a limiting factor, reducing the freedom in how we build armies. There will still be ideal approaches, but we're not being handcuffed as much as some of us may have originally believed. I don't mind the approach. It gives us a feel for what the historical preference of a certain commander may have been, and it makes those preferences more important in our games, while still allowing us to break those preferences if we want to. Now, in some ways, it's an added layer of planning needed as you try to develop bonds between generals of complementary preferences that work well on and off the battlefield. The whole retinue thing is a concept that I have liked and disliked at various points of the Three Kingdoms marketing campaigns, but after having used it, I'm pretty happy with how it comes together, and I'm definitely glad it's not as restrictive as first perceived. Again, any general can recruit any unit into his or her retinue, but there are synergies, and high-tier units are specific to specific commanders. But there's a small problem with army management still. No unit swapping. For some reason, it seems that we're not able to transfer units between retinues. So if you want to swap around high-rank units into a fresh army, or you want to balance your new and old armies, you can't. Now, I should be absolutely clear that I didn't see this in action, but instead was told that this was the case. It's possible that there was a misunderstanding. Even as I write this script, I find this decision surprising to the point I think that I must have misunderstood the developers, even though they literally expressed this.
No, the transfer between retinues.
I think the implication is that the retinue is loyal to the character and wouldn't fight for anybody else. I suppose it makes sense in a way. It forces you to ensure your characters with extremely well-trained retinue are always happy, and it adds extra pain to losing such a retinue. But it also doesn't make sense in some ways. If I have soldiers working for me, and I tell them to follow somebody else for the time being, I'd expect them to follow my orders, especially if they're loyal. It'd be awesome if you could move units recruited under one general around between different retinues, but if the recruiting general were to betray you, all of the troops recruited under them would leave as well. I like the idea of soldiers being loyal to their direct lord, but I find it kind of silly that the loyalty ends at being assigned to a different commander. This is a weird call, especially as I'm somebody who grows attached to units. I'd rather send older ones off to another army than disband it to be replaced by a superior counterpart. I guess death will have to do. Stances are in. I can't believe I live in a world where this has to be a point, but here we are. I can confirm that stances are in, and I can confirm that they are the normal stance, the forced march stance for extra movement, the ambush stance for a chance to ambush, and in-camp stance to replenish supplies. I'm definitely happy to see these back after the strange absence in Thrones of Britannia, and though I know there are differing opinions about the march stance, I'm personally okay with it. I was also happy to see that I needed to use the in-camp stance at one point, not just for fun, but because I'd overextended and supplies were diminished, replenishing very slowly without the assistance from the stance. At sea, we see two stances, the normal one and the full speed one for the extra movement range. All pretty standard affair, but just felt it was worth mentioning. Battles are too fast. Way too fast. Now, to be fair, there are a couple of factors at play here. For one, we were playing Romance mode, which is going to be a faster pace than Records mode. For two, we had some pretty beefy hero characters to use, one of whom had an ability that caused a huge morale debuff of -100. And finally, the devs mentioned that they're still balancing the effectiveness of heroes, and this will likely help reduce the pace quite a bit. This is definitely a problem though. I'm not looking for every battle to be an hour long, but I definitely want them to fit at a comfortable 20 minutes on average for important battles and large city sieges. I feel like that's a fairly approachable length for players of all types. Right now it felt like every battle was over with a handful of charges using heroes, and this is playing on very hard difficulty. I don't want to stress this point too much because we've been told there's balancing to be done, but I did want to put it out there for the devs and community to see and know. Nobody is immortal. Whether playing in Romance or Records mode, immortality does not grace any of your characters. Death comes for all, and death can lead to disarray, a loss of some great character-specific boons, and even the beginning of the end of an otherwise solid campaign. I know many, myself included, were concerned that this character-focused approach to Total War might result in a Warhammer-style treatment of immortal lords that keep coming back to the battlefield for more bruises, so I'm very happy to confirm that this won't be the case. And I'm especially happy that this applies to both modes of gameplay. Selecting heirs, getting married, having kids, and grooming relationships will all matter in the war for China. Now, sometimes generals will get wounded if you're lucky. Other times, they will die. Family trees are in. There's something about the presence of a family tree that legitimizes a campaign in Total War games, in my opinion. Family lines, their mingling, and their continuation. These are all very real and important parts of history, primarily for political reasons, but also as general motivations. Though it looks simplified to a degree, the family tree does allow for some relationship management, including the search for a spouse and the adoption of favored individuals. I'm looking forward to seeing how family affects things in Three Kingdoms. The devs made it sound quite integral to some of the character-centric storytelling, and I'm very excited to see sons and daughters avenging their parents, righting their wrongs, running off on their own during their rebellious teen years, or whatever else the folk at CA have made possible. I'm hoping that this isn't just a screen where you click buttons to make people happy, but where you click buttons to have long-term impacts on a campaign and the story that is being built in every playthrough. Administration. Admin work is about as involved as I'd expect to be in a Total War game, though there are some things that have been dressed a little differently, and some things that behave differently because of other systems at play. For one, adjustable tax rates are in the game. It's not just a matter of taxes being on and off, though your taxation rates are limited by other factors, such as government rank. Apart from that, there's quite a few offices to assign, including one for your heir and one for administrators, basically governors that you can assign to regions to get various benefits. It sounded like some of these officials can also assign you missions, or you can request missions off of them. You can also recruit characters from the current character pool, and you can also get events that allow you to recruit new characters. One such event included a particularly capable soldier who was proving his worth in battle, and so I had the option of sort of raising him in status. Now these characters can be used as others. They can be sent to fight as generals, or they can be used in various administrative ways. Now naturally, some characters are better suited for certain offices based on their attributes that you can see listed on their detail card, and you'll want to spec them with skills, buffs, and equipment accordingly, and use them in the appropriate offices. Now because of espionage mechanics, some of these offices can become more important than others. If your heir is an enemy spy, for example, they can actually trigger a civil war on your faction leader's death as they try to absorb the faction into their masters. Now other offices will likely have other benefits and risks, and I look forward to seeing how all these systems interact with each other. Especially since each of the individuals you're dealing with are supposed to feel like living, breathing characters, and character desires aren't railroaded. This was definitely a relief to see for me, especially as somebody who really wants to get into these grand stories and loves role-playing in all my games when possible. I was worried that characters' starting wants and desires and dislikes would feel very ham-fisted and would force us to make certain choices, creating only one way to play with each character. Based on the stories I've heard and the time I had to play, that seems not to be the case. Instead, there are benefits to creating synergies, and in some cases, those synergies are straight up written out. Keeping people happy is essential, especially as they become more integral to your campaign, and you can see right away that I was struggling with it at the start of my campaign in some cases. I had people who wanted positions of power that I couldn't give them as I lacked the necessary prerequisites, and they grew more and more upset. I was too eager to add to my ranks and was paying for it as these ambitious characters felt slighted, so I went about giving promotions, paying higher salaries, hoping for happiness through wealth. Along the same line of thought comes the fact that there are some things that some people simply don't want to do. Some people don't want to be spies, some people don't want the thrill of battle, and some people don't want to be pencil pushers. You can still force them into some of these roles, but they might betray you or abandon you from the sounds of it. And that balancing act of needs and wants sounds like great fun and leads to the next topic. Harmony versus disharmony. This is more about inter-character relationships specifically, but the various characters in your faction are going to learn to either love or hate each other. At times, traits or prerequisite conditions through history will result in a natural inclination towards or away from certain characters, like the oath-sworn brothers we see here. Apart from pre-existing conditions, some conditions will develop over the course of a campaign, and they'll create harmony or disharmony. There are more details in the interview I did that I'll be releasing soon, but this basically translates into exponential increase or decrease of love or hate between characters. Harmonious characters will work well together, they will celebrate victories together, and they'll be saddened by failure together. Disharmonious characters, meanwhile, might blame each other for failings rather than share in the lamentations. So, yet again, we see how managing these relationships becomes so very important. Characters can become oath-sworn on one end and rivals on the other, and this affects how a campaign might play out, including betrayals, espionage, civil wars, and more. Relationships build stories, and this opens up some really cool possibilities. You can see all the relationships of a character, positive and negative, in their character screen, and you can jump between characters through the screen. This allows you to learn about all the potential plays you have available. Is there somebody who hates your foe? Time to butter them up, perhaps. Is there somebody available in the character recruitment pool that doesn't like one of your key generals? Well, ignore them, they'll only cause trouble. You can also see what is affecting opinions between people, very nicely written out and categorized so you know exactly what you might need to do depending on how you want to nurture relationships. Hell, relationships are deemed important enough to have some of them highlighted when you've selected a faction before starting an actual campaign up. This is all fine and good, but sounds pretty basic, I know. Where things get interesting are in some of these stories I heard from CA, of vassals being raised to equal status, becoming forever loyal, of sons avenging fallen fathers, of generals captured after battle being released, resulting in a positive relationship between two generals on opposite sides of a war. Some serious dilemmas that were born out of decisions and actions taken over the course of a campaign. I really can't wait to see all the possibilities that this system has for us. General speeches are back-ish. I still want to see general speeches brought back in all their glory, with small cutscenes preceding battles, giving us some interesting bits of information, while also representing the general in charge. Three Kingdoms doesn't have that, but it does have something. When you dive into a battle, the loading screen has some added interest with each of your generals having something to say. We were told that what they typically say is about the battle at hand, though sometimes it's just taunting, particularly when the battle is overwhelmingly in the player's favor. I would have liked to see full-on speeches, but I suppose something is better than nothing. We also get banter in the middle of battle. We've already seen that in action before, and if I'm honest, it actually gets in the way a little bit at times. It's feedback I've passed on, though. Hopefully they tweak it a little bit. Massive tech tree. The tech tree is impressively large, with intricately intertwined paths further down each of the branches, and their intertwining is actually expressed when you hover over the UI. It kind of tells you what else you need to research, so it's very nicely designed. It actually communicates very clearly what you need to do to get from start to finish. Now, worth noting is the fact that they're not actually called technologies, but instead they're being called reforms. Now, it's all the same mechanically, but I think calling them reforms better expresses the types of things we can get here. It is as interesting as it is beautiful. Reforms unlock all manner of things from buildings to units to diplomatic actions and stronger economic benefits, all while affecting the satisfaction of various characters as well, as they prefer certain kinds of reforms over others based on their personalities. We also see the unlocking of faction-wide benefits. Again, these are reforms, they're not just technologies. So, for example, some things will increase public order. Others will have characters gain experience faster. Others still will allow for more missions at a time. Corruption reduction, recruitment rates, number of available characters at a time. The tree is very dense and intricate, and it feels like a multitude of playstyles will need to have a variety of approaches to the same tree. It also makes reference to some very real historical aspects, something worth noting if you were worried that the technology would be romanticized too much. I know I was. Now, the only unfortunate thing here is that the tech tree is actually consistent across all factions. I was hoping to find more nuance between the different factions, and I imagine any DLC factions that we get may have some unique elements. Time will tell. Lots of stats. There is a ton of information to be absorbed between units, characters, and their equipment. The stats go, I think, much deeper than they ever have in a Total War game, and they actually tell us up front things like attack rates or evasion chances, armor piercing versus base damage, and other details that we haven't had access to in the front end in the past. Now, characters also have a ton of information attached to each other, letting you know all sorts of details, giving you a lot of the underlying math that determines how the characters behave and feel. You can also see each character's records separately, as if they were all their own factions. Now, attributes give you a general understanding of the kind of role the character might excel in, but units and characters have much more detail available on their unit cards, as you can see here. Very excited to see all this information up front. Hopefully it just allows us to be a bit more wise in the decision-making process on campaign and battle maps. Multiplayer remains the same. It's the unfortunate reality and cycle of Total War games, it seems. There isn't enough player interest in multiplayer, so there isn't enough reason to develop it further, so there isn't enough player interest. An endless loop. So we're getting head-to-head campaigns between two players, we're getting lobbies, and we're getting ranked battles. Oh, and it's all possible in both records and romance modes. Now, if you want more serious focus on multiplayer, it seems the best way to make your voice heard is to actually play it, because they just look at all the stats to spread their development dollars. Now, all that said, head-to-head campaign should be made very interesting, especially with the espionage mechanics, and I'm planning on doing a couple with some people on the channel. River traversal. Rivers cut through China, and they are used for transportation of goods and people alike. The game keeps this in mind, and armies can move through strategic paths with ease, and in my short time playing, I didn't see the AI take advantage of the river, but right at the end, I took to the waters to try and head further inland faster. Now, this creates an interesting option for more mobile forces, allowing you some freedom of movement early on, especially if you start without a settlement. Either way, I feel like I shouldn't have to mention this, but I was definitely worried about river traversal being excluded or lackluster. No naval battles. That's right, this time I can say I heard it with my own 2 ears. There are no naval battles in Three Kingdoms. While you can travel up and down rivers to cut through the land, you won't actually be manually fighting battles with ships of any kind. The justification for the exclusion is one of historical relevance. Though a handful of naval battles happened in the era and control of the rivers was very important at times, it seems that there just wasn't enough to justify including naval battles compared to some of the other new mechanics. They haven't been completely abandoned for the series, but in my opinion, the exclusion here is unfortunate. Not the end of the world, but hey, at least it hasn't been abandoned forever. Battle changes. Apart from the pace of battle, there have been some improvements to how the battlefields work. Some of these changes are just bringing back old things, but some are new. Now, for example, there's a bit of a quick deployment system available now where you can select a bunch of units and click and drag to deploy them, and they'll automatically form up in an appropriate way. Archers at the back, cavalry at the flanks, that sort of thing. It speeds up the deployment process if you're doing something generic, and it makes it more easily approachable for new players, but leaves us the option of getting more nuanced if we want. We also see a great improvement in stat representation, as I've already mentioned, and so now we see much better stat comparisons happening as well in the midst of battle. That way, if you can actually read the stats and familiarize yourself with the icons, you make smarter decisions. Now, watchtowers don't explode on being captured, which will be an interesting evolution over time if battles last long enough, and the awesome ranges that the archers exhibit should allow for more interesting skirmishing. We've seen plenty of duels, and they're pretty neat. Nothing more to add on that topic of duels that we haven't already seen. Now, I'm personally not a fan of the unit cards though. They don't communicate information well enough, quickly enough, and I'm also not a fan of these icons being used to represent units. I much prefer having the banners as well as the icons. The floating banners don't feel real by any means, but they're a bit more, I don't know, palatable than just these circular icons from Attila. All in all, some pretty solid improvements to the battlefield. We'll have to see how it all plays out, especially when it comes to the difference in pace and the two systems of play. AI diplomacy. We've seen a lot about diplomacy in the game already, thanks to Creative Assembly's videos, and I dove into what we learned in previous videos, but I just want to mention here that the AI seems to be using diplomacy options that is available to it, but at times the motivations didn't necessarily make sense to me. Not saying they were wrong, but I just couldn't see the logic. Now, I think this is something that more playtime will clarify, but it was nice to play on very hard difficulty and not just have everybody take advantage of a weak start by simply declaring war, instead looking to forge non-aggression pacts and even a coalition nice and early. Diplomacy still needs to be put to the test, as so far I just didn't get enough time to make a judgment call. Technical info. Most of us were playing on Intel computers with 1080 Ti's and saw no lag. This confirms that the game is made for current technology, so set aside your fears from the Attila days. Now, some people saw a little bit of stuttering in massive siege battles, but this build is a few months old, so let's not dwell on that, but we will keep an eye out for it during the review process. Now, day and night cycles on the campaign map are 10 minutes long, but they can be set to a few things, including real time, that uses the system clock. Colorblind settings are available, camera smoothing, better depth of field, UI scaling, these are all present, and they've upgraded the anti-aliasing systems. They've clearly done a lot of work to the lighting systems as well, and we've also seen some filters being added to make things look very vibrant, colorful, and crisp. Now, there are still some tweaks to the overall look to come, and though this point might be a bit more technical than others, I thought some of you might be interested in this information. I hope you found this video informative, and if you'd like to see more Total War and strategy gaming content, make sure you subscribe to this channel. There's a lot more to come before and after release. As always, I'd like to give a massive thanks to my channel members and patrons who help keep the channel alive 1 month at a time, and I'd also like to thank the folks at Creative Assembly who invited me down to the event. Of course, above all, I'd like to thank you for watching. Until next time, cheers.